Всім привіт. Hello, everybody. Hello, Eric.
Hello.
Is everything okay with your mic and connection?
It seems to be, yeah.
Great. Let's begin our talk. My name is Максим Шевчук. I'm a founder of the biggest Ukrainian podcast community, PodcastSNOWua. Today, I am honored to present you a podcast producer, founder of podcast studio Magnificent Noise, strategist and media consultant, author of the book Make Noise, A Creator's Guide to Podcasting, and a great audio storytelling, Ерік Ньюзум.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I hope people applaud. Just a few words from me before we begin. So our agenda for today. We will have a small talk with Eric for 25-30 minutes. And after that, people from the audience could raise hand and ask a question. If you have some difficulties with English, you can write your question in Ukrainian in our podcasting chat in Telegram. Web address of this chat is in my profile. So, Eric, if you are ready, let's begin.
Sure.
Great. And the first question is, can you please briefly tell us about your experience in podcasting? How you started? What shows have you produced?
Well, I was working at National Public Radio, which is the public non-commercial radio service in the United States, and was working there on broadcasting, was basically what I was doing. And podcasting kind of emerged right kind of with my arrival there at that network. And I spent a considerable amount of time kind of like following podcasting and thought it was very interesting, and made the case that NPR should be involved in podcasting. And made that case so successfully that the CEO of NPR at the time said, great, well, if you think it's such a great idea, you can do it. So I was put in charge of doing so and coming up with a pathway for NPR to distribute programs not just through terrestrial broadcast stations, but also via podcast. And so did that for a number of years. And during that time, NPR introduced well over 100 podcasts during that time. And then afterwards, I went to Audible, which is an audiobook and digital audio company based in the United States, and produced original content there before I started working with our company that we created about 3 years ago called Magnificent.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. Now I had a question about your book. I think that your book, Make Noise, I think this is in some way a Bible for podcasters. You describe all of the main principles of a great show on its pages. Please give some tips for those people who just want to start a podcast.
I think the most important thing, and I think the book really focuses on a couple things. The book is really meant to transcend time. There are many books about podcasting that will tell you what microphone to buy or what editing software to use, and I do none of that at all. It's really focused on principles of storytelling and really understanding what makes for a good podcast, almost at the DNA level of having a real clear intention and understanding of what your podcast is. And so there's a kind of a list of questions I think are really good for people entering the podcast space to ask themselves and let the answers guide them in their activities. And I think that these same questions apply to people who've been in media their entire career and are just using a podcast as a new tool. And to be honest, when we start up podcasts, which we do, many times a year, ask ourselves the same list of questions. And the list of questions is really, what are you trying to say? What is your message? Mm-hmm. What are you so passionate about? And it's so important to you that you do it for free as a labor of love. And beyond that question, having a very clear idea of who you're speaking to. Because if you say your podcast is for everyone, it's really for no one. Yeah. Podcasts succeed when they have a very clear sense of who they're speaking to, what they have to say, and who they're speaking to. And there are two other questions that we ask as well. And one is, who are you, a podcaster? If you are doing a podcast about the future, and you personally think the future is an exciting time, and you're excited to see where our world evolves, that's a very different podcast than if you have a feeling that everything is going to be dystopian and horrible. Those are two very different podcasts. So it's not just understanding who it is, who you're speaking to, but understanding who you are and what you bring to it. And then the final thing is understanding what the point is. Why am I doing this podcast? Am I doing this because I want to change something? Am I doing this because I want to be the voice of a community of people who care about the thing that I care about? All these things are important. And if you don't have answers for them, it's really hard to be successful. And if you have answers for them, it's much easier to know if what you're doing is worthwhile, because you've basically defined what success looks like.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Great answer. In your book, you write about 10 words rule to describe a podcast. How did you find the right formula?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah. In your book, you write about 10 words rule to describe a podcast. How did you find the right formula? How much time you need to find that formula?
Oh, it's interesting. So what you're talking about is there's a chapter in the book that outlines something that many of the podcasts that we do, we make them describe themselves in 10 words or less, because it's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do, and you also have to do it in a way that describes what you're working on and nothing else in the world. Like there's one thing that can be described that way, and it's your podcast. And that's, again, another exercise to get like the levels of intention that I was previously talking about. And we came to that as an idea when I was working at NPR. There was a show called Tell Me More, which had started out and had a little bit of a rough beginning, because I in hindsight, it really didn't have a clear idea of what it was trying to do. It was trying to do a bunch of things, but I wasn't sure that the staff had a level of clarity of that, and they didn't have a cohesive message to present to an audience. So the audience understood what they were going to get out of it. And so one morning, out of frustration, we said, well, let's define what this show is. And there was 4 of us in the room, the host, myself, 4 or 5 of us in the room, the host, myself, the executive producer, and like some executive. And we sat there and argued about it all morning. We came up with something like, we understand that. Like, we can tell what Tell Me More is, and then you could look at any story idea and say, does that fit that mold of what that show is? So if your 10-word description, for example, is kids talking about books, their favorite books, and then you had, R.L. Stine, a publicist called you up and said, R.L. Stine would like to be interviewed on your show, you can then say, well, is that kids talking about books? And like, no, it really isn't. And so you should then not do it. And so we came up with that exercise basically as a way to get out of what are called subjective qualifiers, which is I say something's good and you say something's bad. That's subjective. It's based on our opinion. But can we come up with create something that allows us to make decisions based off something that we both agree on? like some truth, some statement, so that we can say it's no longer that I think it's good and you think it's bad. It's, do we think that our idea moves forward or lines up with the 10-word description we've created for this show? And those conversations are much more elevated and end in a much better place than just wearing each other down until one of you gives in.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. I hope our listeners take this rule of 10 words rule as a main rule in their podcasting. Please tell us, which way is podcasting moving in the United States, and which kind of shows are demand nowadays?
That's interesting. I think that one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is how the rest of the world, as podcasting kind of professionalizes throughout the rest of the world, I'm really starting to think how much different. It's always been, for many years, it's been an assumption that look at where the United States is in podcasting, and other territories and countries throughout the world are behind it and will eventually catch up to the place it is. And I don't think that's true anymore. So I'm going to give you this answer, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that answer is going to be the same answer for anywhere else in the world. And I think you have, some very, very kind of cliche formats in podcasting right now. You have the witty banter, a couple of people sitting around a table and amusing themselves with a conversation about subject X. It could be anything. You have kind of the narrative journey into some unknown story or some investigation or a journey, or like you're going along to discover a story. And you're seeing a lot of celebrities at all level of celebrities. Not necessarily just, like movie stars, well-known people, but even someone who's a celebrity in a very niche world, starting podcasts as a way to be a voice in that community. And, a lot of what is doing well in the United States is being dictated by what advertisers are most excited to support, because it is so advertising driven. And my guess is in the rest of the world, the reason the rest of the world will be different is because advertising will be not as much of a driving force elsewhere, and other forms of revenue will be a driving force.
I understand. Thank you very much. In Ukraine, maybe I think you're right, because in Ukraine there were no podcasting market and no audio market as well, as I said, as I read in United States. Okay. And for the final question from me, and we'll begin to ask our listeners. Final question from me: what are your favorite shows from those that you have made, and shows from other publishers or solo podcasters? What do you recommend to listen?
Well, I always say that my favorite thing is the last thing I made. That answer always changes. And the last project I finished was something called Far Flung, which is a podcast I did with TED. People do TED Talks. And it asks the question, what does, if a city were to give a TED Talk, what would the city say? And looks at 10 different cities around the world. And it's really fun. And it's kind of a romp, and lots of unexpected things happen. And so that's something that I've made recently that I think people would enjoy. And I am a big fan of narrative podcasts. I think Dolly Parton's America, which came out quite some time ago, is a really extraordinary podcast, and something that I have enjoyed quite a bit. That is, there's a show called West Cork, which is coming out next week, which is something I worked at when I was at Audible, and is coming out as a regular podcast starting next week.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions. Guys in our room, please raise your hand and I check our chat. From chat, no questions. And raise your hand. Maybe people need some more time to yeah, I have invite. Yes.
Hello, Eric.
Hello.
My question is about what are your plans for the future, and what topic do you think you would like to make a podcast or a show or a talk on in the future, and why this topic?
That's an interesting question. So I think that I have, through a lot of my career, I've worked on things that have defined seasons. Like there's 10 episodes of this show. We produce the 10 episodes, and then maybe 6 months or a year later, we release another 10 episodes. And it really feels much like a television season where it's a beginning and an end and then some dead zone in between. And I find myself looking more and more towards developing show ideas that kind of start and never really stop. So if you release an episode every week or 2 weeks, it goes on forever. And that's a very different type of storytelling, because if I'm producing an 8-episode season of something that I spend a year and a half working on, that's very different amount of resource and a very different amount of cost and a very different amount of how I use my time than something if I'm putting it out once a week forever. So I think that's kind of, it's less about the genre or the type of program and more about the way it's released. That's how I think things are continuing to evolve. It's very difficult to find a way to pay for a 6 or 8 part podcast series that it tells a story and that's all there is to it. It's very difficult to find a way to pay for that unless someone's paying for it. Mm. And so I think both financially and from a building a relationship with an audience and maintaining that relationship over time, the regular cadence is much more important than the shorter run series. It's kind of that's how I would choose to answer it. This isn't entirely how you asked that question, but that's how I'm going to answer it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Oksana. Vlad, you also have to raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Eric, if there is one thing that you would advise an inexperienced podcaster not to do, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question, Vlad. I would say that have a realistic plan for how you're going to build an audience. So there are 20,000 new podcasts a week, right? If you just want to put your podcast out there in the world and see what happens, there's no mystery there. I will tell you what's going to happen, and nobody's going to listen to it. Right? Podcasting is very easy to do, but it takes work to succeed at. And so I think that a lot of podcasters think that their job is to create a podcast and put it out in the world. And I often tell them that your work is only halfway over when you do that. You have to have a very specific and clear plan about how you're going to go out there and make some noise and ring a bell and get people's attention to get to listen to it. That's the other half of the work. And that for creators who think their job is just to make the show, that's unfortunately, they're not setting themselves up for success.
That's a great answer, but if I may, can I have please a chance for one more question, Maxim? Yeah, in this regard, and what you just have brilliantly put through. So, is it a better strategy for a let's say podcast startup, right, to leverage a platform that already exists and focus on the content, and make noise this way, or is it better to bring up their own platform, their own server, their own website, their own RSS feeds, whatever, and leverage technology that comes with it, with all that, to do so, like advertising, context advertising, Facebook, Google, all that kind of stuff? What would you advise?
That's also a very good question. You ask very good questions, Vlad. I am not a fan of pinning your hopes on someone else building your podcast for you, because that really isn't the business that networks and platforms are in. And no one is going to do a better job of promoting your podcast than you, right? I feel the advice I give to podcasters about working with distributors or networks is the same advice that was historically given to many musical acts like rock bands and so on and so forth when they were coming up in their career and trying to figure out when they should approach a record company. And that is, keep control over everything yourself until it grows too big for you to do it on your own. And then look at the people, not in what they're waving in front of you, but are they going to help build it bigger? Because I think a healthy relationship with a network doesn't create an audience for you. It creates more audience for you. Takes the audience you have and kind of exposes it in a bigger way. They don't make money for you. They make you more money. You should already be figuring ways to make money on your own as a podcaster. And because the idea that a network or a distributor is going to take your unknown podcast and throw it in front of people and make it a hit, that there's no examples of where that has ever happened. And I would love to know where that fallacy started. Because the truth is that they're not in that business. That they only have so much effort. And if they have effort, they're going to put it behind an established hit to make it a bigger hit. Or take a small hit and make it into a big hit. Or apply it to someone who's a really famous person, figuring their podcast is going to be easy to sell and market. So the idea of an unknown coming with a podcast and having a network or a distributor do anything is A, highly unlikely, and B, there are a number of companies who are signing podcasts up under the idea that if they sign up 1,000 podcasts, one or two of them may actually become big and famous, and then they can work with them. And they do nothing to any of them. They just kind of are playing the law of averages, right? Or that one is going to strike out of all these different things. And often the deals they offer are so unfavorable to the creators that those creators will regret them because they're basically being screwed. And so I just tell people, your job is not to put out an audio file every week or every month or whatever. Your job is to build a relationship with a group of people who are your audience. And the primary means you do that is the audio file. But you are a curator of a community. Now, that community exists around your podcast. It may, they will want to talk to you. They will want to talk to each other. They will want to interact. And the only person who's going to be able to do that authentically is you. And that's what they want. And when it grows to the point you can't manage it anymore, then you look for someone to partner with. Because otherwise, you're going to be either frustrated or you're going to get screwed.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Very reassuring.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Vlad. Now in such way, Hanna, then Kalina, and then Alexei.
Eric, thank you for advices and being with us. And my first podcast I've heard was one story in 8 podcasts. It was wind of change, or somebody was telling very funny story. And now I recognize that I'm listening every week, some 3 or 4 authors. And my question is mainly, do we really, like, if we are working in the radio, you need to have regular broadcasting of some programs. And should we really repeat the same? Does it make sense to make this repeatedly, to set broad topic like medieval talks or whatever it is, and to have it regularly? Does it work like this? Or it's better to choose one story, to make one podcast for 8 episodes, tell this story and that's it, and go further?
So, it's interesting. I kind of answered this earlier I see that the trend of like something like winds of change that you mentioned, or it's one story over however many episodes, is really a becoming less and less frequent for people who are producing podcasts, because they're very difficult to finance and they're very difficult to build an audience for. It's very, very hard. And I would say that so that leans more towards the where you're doing something that's ongoing. It's very interesting because I think that something that's kind of embedded in your question, but isn't exactly what you asked, is the relationship between podcasting and radio. And I see so many broadcasters who come into podcasting and are frustrated because they expect it to be just like a digital version of radio. And podcasting and radio are the same in that they are both audio mediums, but almost nothing else about them is the same. The way that people use radio is very, very different than the way people use podcasting. When people turn on the radio, they're usually not doing it for a specific program. They just want to hear what that station's format is or what they're broadcasting at that time. And they want to hear news, or they want to hear rock and roll, or they want to hear symphonic music. These are the things that radio station offers, and that's what they want to hear. Podcasting is much more deliberate in that people choose to listen to something specific. I'm in the mood to hear this, or I'm in the mood to hear this, to laugh at these guys, or the way this woman looks at the world of business is very interesting to me, and so I love hearing that, and I listen to her. It's much more intention-driven and much more specific. And that affects so many, like I can go on and on and on about the differences between radio and podcasting. It's something I've thought about and wrote about quite a bit. But I would say that the understanding that the audience uses it in 2 different ways is really important. And also understand that radio tends to be broad in its approach, because in order for something to be successful in the radio, it has to reach a large cross-section of people. And in podcasting, when you try to be general or broad, you often fail because you are not being something specific intended for a specific group of people. And almost every successful podcast takes that approach. If you look at Radiolab, it's not about all science. It's about certain types of science stories that they really find fascinating and are very good at telling. And it's not pretending to be everything about science. It's just pretending to be about some science stories that they like. And you can go on and on about that, which I won't.
Thank you for taking my question from my question. You are right. I was asking about the radio, and actually the talkative radio, which is dying now, and how to say, coming to the life again through the podcasts. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Thank you, Hannah. Kalina, question from you.
Good evening. Thank you for a Spartan conversation. Eric, you have a great experience. Maybe you can help me. What advertising do you recommend for the podcast? I was running one on Facebook and it was a completely fiasco.
Oh, it was a fiasco, meaning running advertising?
Yeah, because we have like views, but not listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's hard. I think the best advertising relationships is where somebody really understands what you're trying to do and really supports what you're trying to do. Like they believe in what you're doing, and it's not just, some sort of generic kind of relationship. And it's, you also want to make sure that when you're taking advertisers, that you're taking people that you think you can really help and measurably help. And so it isn't that you're just taking any advertising. It's like, I'm doing a podcast about sewing, making your own clothes. And the advertising I'm taking is from something that would be really of interest to that audience, like from someone who makes sewing scissors or sewing machine parts or fabric, custom fabric. And you think that the people who like your podcast would really like the products of that manufacturer. Or I do a podcast about the outdoors, and there's an outdoor equipment manufacturer that I'm trying to bring on as an advertiser. And so I think it's important to make sure you're picking people who are a great match and who really will support your work and really want to reach the people who listen to your podcast. And that takes a lot of work, but that does seem like that's the best way to end up with a good relationship with an advertiser, is being able to make sure you should be taking advertising from them.
Thank you so much for your advice.
Sure, no problem.
Kalina, thank you. Alexei?
Hello, guys. Hello, Eric.
Hello.
Just to give you a background of my question. So we are making a podcast for a community, and we are doing a talkative show to kind of discuss on a monthly basis what's going on, and bring some guests to bring their opinion and basically their outcome of this podcast. So that many people reached out to us saying like, well, we are not a part of the community, but we want to be, and now we are just going once per month to your show, and it's a great summary of what's going on in the community. This is kind of the background of my podcast, right? And basically the question that I have, and that we have a lot of discussions with my co-hosts, is should we limit the duration of the podcast in this setup? And this will be first thing. And second, what would be your take on the duration of a podcast? Should it be fixed? Should it be different depending on the topic? Does it depend on the narrative podcast or a talkative show? Or just curious about this. Because all the other things that you're saying, like frequency, community, is indeed sounds same for me, and I agree with the things, but the duration is something that I really don't understand now.
Yeah, well, I don't understand it either. I look at a lot of podcasts, and I kind of question, why is this thing so long? Right? I am increasingly convinced that I have nothing to base this off of, but I'm convinced that podcasting should be designed. A length should be designed around the audience and how the audience is going to use it. So if you are really if you're creating something that's meant to be consumed over a long period of time, and having a longer podcast is fine. But if you're trying to design like a number of people I know say that we want to design something that fits in well with people's commuting patterns. Well, that's easy to determine. Most everywhere you can determine how long an average commute is. And if you're trying to create something that's meant to be listened to on a commute, which in the United States is about, the average commute is about 26 minutes, and you're creating something that's an hour and a half long, I don't understand how you expect someone to listen to something that's an hour and a half inside of 26 minutes. And so maybe you should be rethinking that. Another thing is, I just had a client of our company who wants to create a podcast designed for CEOs and C-suite executives and leaders of companies. And they also were looking at these hour-long conversations. And I said, what CEO do you know has an hour to sit around and listen to this jibber-jabber? Like, Like having an hour-long interview is not something they're going to find useful. You should do something extremely short, which just gets the basic points and doesn't have a lot of extra stuff there. For that audience, that feels like it's right. And so I don't think there is a universal answer. And if you ever ask that question to someone, how long should a podcast be? And they give you a specific answer for all podcasts, never listen to anything that person says again, because they are giving you something that's generic and not going to be terribly useful for you and your podcast. So again, if you answer those questions I talk about at the beginning, one of them being, who is your audience? You just don't say who they are, but like you kind of get an understanding of what their life is like. We designed a show for ESPN called ESPN Daily, which was a 5-day-a-week experience that ESPN wanted to create as a podcast. And their idea of an audience member was this guy who's a dad and has a bunch of friends who exchange texts all the time about sports. And he wants to be able to not only participate in that, but have ideas of things to talk about. But he's very, very time poor. And his commute to work is the only time when he is able to be the one who determines what's playing at that moment. He can't listen to things at work, and at home it's always his wife and kids. And so that period of time is his. So we created ESPN Daily to be less than 20 minutes and be one story about that. Not all the stories in sports, not the biggest story in sports, but like what's a great story that you can tell in 18 minutes. And we did this because we wanted to play it for this target listener we imagined. And then he can like talk about it with his friends later, and he understands the whole story. And because he's so time poor, he doesn't have time to listen to something that's an hour long, let alone longer. So I hope that answers your question or helps.
Yeah, thank you very much. And possibly a second one, the last one. Sorry for taking everybody's time. And how then the listening speed comes into play? Because I'm as a regular listener, I consume sometimes at a speed of 1.5, sometimes at speed of 2. And basically, as a podcaster, which is hour long, I could listen in a car driving to the office for 30 minutes, right? And I'll get their information from the podcast. Thanks.
Yeah, I know people do that. I think I don't support it, and I don't think it's the way things. I design things to be listened to in real time, and if people do listen to it at faster speeds because they choose to, that's fine. That's their choice. I don't think that's something I think about when I'm making things. In fact, I've had a number of people complain about things I've made because they have sound in them or music in them, and it makes it really hard to listen to it at faster speeds. And I understand that they don't like it, but that's fine with me.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Alexei. Eric, I have also 2 questions from our chat. The first one from Dmitro. Do you feel any influence of an old American commercial radio tradition over podcasting? Or it is much more influenced by other modern media, television, internet blogs, music industry? Which of them do you value the most?
So it's interesting. I think that there is a lot of influence from other media, and it comes because the people who are creating podcasts come from those other media. So they are they're from commercial radio, or they're from television, or they're from movies, and they bring their storytelling and audio work to podcasting, and with a mixture of success. And I think that there are some of them who come to podcasting and do really well. Most of them fail. And the reason they fail is they assume that because they know how to make a movie, that they know how to make a podcast. Or they know because they know how to make commercial radio, they know how to make a podcast, and all these other things. I think it becomes very difficult. It's the same thing I mentioned earlier in answer to another question about the differences between commercial radio and podcasting. It applies to all other forms of storytelling too. And I meet so many people who, because they made a successful television show, assume that podcasting is just audio. I can do this. And I say, I wouldn't take that attitude. And then a year later, they're kind of wondering what happened to their podcast and why it didn't become a hit. So I think that that's a consideration. Yeah, it's been very influenced and will continue to be influenced as more and more people pour into podcasting. These people have experience on other platforms and bring that experience with them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very clear answer. And second one question, also from Metro. Speaking of audience listening habits and designing your podcast around them, would you advise more instruments to grasp this kind of feedback from your audience that already have proved their efficiency for you?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Repeat one more time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See if it.
Speaking of audience listening habits and designing your podcast around them, would you advise more instruments to grasp this kind of feedback from your audience that already?
I understand. Now I understand. Right. Mm-hmm. So the answer depends on if you already have a podcast or not. If you already have a podcast, I think it's great to use your audience in all kinds of ways. I think your audience are great for promoting your podcast. They're great for finding advertisers. You just ask them often, and they will like, do you know of a company that would be a real good match for us for advertising? You'd be surprised. People will write you and tell you. If you ask them for questions, if you say, I'm going to do us on this subject or this story, do you have things you want to know? Of course, you'd be surprised as to how quick people are when they are fans of your podcast to kind of give you that kind of help and feedback. So that's number one, is go through and ask. And you can also say to your audience, I really want to understand who you are and how you use this show when you listen. And other ways I can improve, and you can design kind of like basically a listener survey. You can do that through for free through Google Forms. You can do that through tools like SurveyMonkey, which are a little bit more sophisticated and not very expensive, and I think they even do have free versions. But you can just do basically an audience survey and ask your audience to fill it out, and you'll be surprised that they will do so. They will give you those answers. So if you're already established in podcasting, that's the easy way to do it, is to just ask them. And you'll be surprised at how enthusiastic they will be in giving you answers. If you do not have a podcast and you're starting from zero, a very smart thing to do is to, as you answer some of those questions we talked about in the beginning of who is this podcast for and what are we trying to achieve, you'll get a model of what that listener is like. And you will probably, because most successful podcasters create content for people they know or types of people that they know or groups they're a part of, ask other people. Like, if you're trying to speak to a certain community, ask them, if I would do a podcast for you, how long should it be? Or what should I talk about? Those type of things. And ask them, and just keep asking people over and over and over and over again. People are always happy to give their opinion on almost anything. So if you ask people, they'll give you advice. And I think that's a really good way to look at learning about the audience. You don't have to guess. Just, there's a friend of mine who is a researcher, audience researcher, who says, why wonder when you can know? And that's usually her answer to almost everything. Why wonder when you can know? And so you ask, how can I know? For existing podcasts, it's just asking the audience in the episodes to respond to a quick survey, give them an easy-to-remember URL, and ask them. For podcasts you're going to start working on, identify who your target audience is, go to people who match that profile, and ask them the same questions.
Eric, thank you very much for very clear answer. If somebody have some questions, we have few more minutes.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Sure.
What challenges will the podcast author face if he develops it under the umbrella of the big brand, like Gimlet Media or Spotify?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understood the question. I heard you talk about Gimlet and Spotify, and I'm not quite sure what about them I'm answering.
I meant about some minuses and challenges with which podcaster will face in case he will develop its podcast under some umbrella brand.
Yeah, so it's really if you look at if you're going to do something with Spotify and you're going to pitch something to Spotify, Spotify does take pitches and does basically green light and fund production of certain podcasts. They tend to work only with very experienced podcasters. And the downside of that is that it will only be available on that one platform. And I am not a big fan of restricting access to content. I think that it doesn't work terribly well. I think you get a fraction of what you would normally get because you are not because you're putting it in an exclusive space. And unless that exclusive space means that you're getting content that otherwise wouldn't be available or couldn't be made unless it was an exclusive arrangement, I just don't see what the benefit is. And I see so many negatives to it. So whenever someone is talking about, I will give you some money for your podcast or to make your podcast or to distribute it, but you can only put it on my app or my platform or in my network and nowhere else, I get very skeptical. And I often counsel people to ask, who is benefiting from this relationship? And are the trade-offs worth it? And oftentimes they really aren't. So I'd be very cautious about exclusive relationships. That said, there are some occasions where it just isn't possible for someone to make something unless they have someone providing some funds or resources. And I would just be very careful about what relationships you get into, what rights you are turning over. A lot of places that want to sign you up to make a podcast, when you look at the contract they offer, you are basically selling them the podcast and becoming pretty much like an employee of theirs. And that's not good business practice. So I'd be very, very careful about how you get into any relationship with a platform or a company.
Clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. We have one more question in our chat, but this question is the same as Kilina asked you, so I won't even tell. Okay, friends. If somebody want to ask Eric something, we have a time for one more question. But if there are no questions, we'll finish our Clubhouse and our conversation for today. Okay. Eric, thank you for your time and for your answers.
My pleasure.
Hope you also enjoy our conversation as me, because for me it's very interesting to hear you, to hear your answers and ask questions directly from you. Because when I read your book, I just think, it would be super great to find a contact to talk with you about podcasting. Thank you one more time. And one more question from our chat before we finish.
Okay.
do you see the Clubhouse role in the audio content world? What do you see? What you think the future of Clubhouse is?
I don't know. I think that there's. I'm really intrigued by the idea of doing something that has both the ability to do real-time live conversations like this, which I think podcasting does very poorly. Anything that's live or in the moment or changes frequently, podcasting is very bad at that. But Clubhouse could be very good. Clubhouse, I think, is much more of a threat to live broadcast radio than it is to podcasting. And I think that there's room in the audio spectrum for both something that is live and in the moment and something that is a bit more of a podcast-like experience, which is on demand, non-linear.
Great. Thank you very much. Guys, thank you for all of us that you be with us for this hour. Eric, thank you one more time. If you have some questions for us, I hope we can also give answers. If no, I want to say for you, have a good evening, and I hope that one day we could gather together for one more talk.
That'd be great.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Eric.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thank you.
Всім дякую за увагу. До зустрічі 15 березня.